Welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations Live. I'm your host, Pierre Quinn, and here on Courageous Conversations, we're leveraging the stories of leaders, of creatives, of entrepreneurs to help you live and lead with greater courage. My guest on Courageous Conversations today is Dr. William Putsis. Bill, thanks for being my guest today.
Hey, Pierre, great to be here. You're not aware of this, but I'm going to start out by embarrassing you. Hopefully, not too much. But last night, in preparation for our call, I was watching some of your Blackboard videos, and they are just whiteboard videos, I should say. I'm so used to teaching still on blackboards in the classroom sometimes, but they were awesome. Really, really good stuff. I love the delivery and the focus and the content.
That means a lot coming from you, a world-renowned B-school professor and consultant. And we're going to get into that in just a bit. I want to do a couple of things with our viewing audience or our replay audience. Folks, if you've been with us on Courageous Conversations before, you know what to do. If this is your first time, the tutorial is really simple. Number one, hop in the comments. Let us know you're hanging out with us. We'll give you a shout out. Number two, you are going to have some questions for Bill. Drop those in. You don't want to lose your opportunity to ask him live. And number three, Friday, as we're recording this, is the perfect day for sharing. So go ahead and hit that share button so other leaders can enjoy this experience as well. Okay, Bill, give us the snapshot. I know, it takes a lot longer than a snapshot to get the real story, but give us a little snapshot about you and your work.
I'll try and give the short version. It's funny. I always like to say that sometimes you bring through what you do in life and it all comes together. I started out actually getting my PhD in economics. I'm an economist by training. I was actually on the economics faculty at Cornell early on in my career. And then eventually I came to business school and business school faculty since 1990. Yeah, that long ago. Started out at Yale, went to the London Business School, and then came back to UNC Chapel Hill and also teach an executive program still at places like Yale and at Duke. I also wrote a couple books on strategy that I think were pretty well received, and they're basically the subject of what I work with companies. And I have a consulting firm, Chestnut Associates, that I've been running since 1995 that work with a whole set of Fortune 100 all the way down to small entrepreneurial startups, basically applying the principles that I espouse in those two books. And that's kind of the short version of the longer story. So what I'd like to tell people is I do a combination of what we learn from academics with what we learn from companies in real life as I work with them, bringing together strategy, marketing, economics.
We're going to pull on that thread a little bit more. I want to ask you, in your experience and from your perspective, what is the function of a good business school professor?
So great question, Pierre, as you always do. I think there are two extremes, and with one extreme, and both, by the way, are very valuable. One is the pure academic, someone who engages in theory, publishes an academic journal, but doesn't really have the contact, at least other than in a short cursory fashion with businesses. And there's a role for that. It's an important role in that we kind of push the boundaries of what we do and understand by studying what businesses do. On the other extreme are what we call the practitioners, sometimes professors in the practice, in the business school role, where what they do is they come from an industry background. Great example on the Yale School of Management faculty is someone by the name of John Iwata. I know John well. He's a really great guy, absolutely brilliant branding guy. He was the head of IBM branding for almost 25 years. Direct reports to 3 CEOs at IBM, recently retired, and he's now teaching those principles and studying them in the context of the business school. Those are kind of the two extremes, and every gradation in between. And I often argue good business schools, and most of the top 20 have this, as a combination of anyone at either end of the spectrum or in between. And so the idea of blending what we learn from the best of academic theories and the best of insight to businesses together to give practical guides to not only students, but to businesses and when we work with them. That's kind of my view. Longer, maybe winded answer than you wanted, Pierre, but that's part of the role of a faculty member or professor, as we get long-winded sometimes.
No, it definitely works. Now, if you go on your website, listed in the banner below, your client list, and if you Google you and look at YouTube videos, your client list reads sort of like a who's who of top organizations in the world. When you're working in a consultancy capacity, how much, or how often do you dip into your business school professor hat and maybe find yourself teaching some maybe even basic or advanced principles versus now living as this professor in practice and actually coaching or partnering with the organization to achieve certain outcomes?
And Pierre, I argue, I would say probably 100%. I can't think of an instance where I would ever come in and do pure consulting. And there are multiple reasons for that. What I like to say, and this is not meant to be disparaging towards consultants. Consultants do great work, and a lot of companies out there do great things with companies. But I often repeat the joke that the old definition of a consultant is someone who steals your watch and wants to sell it back to you over and over and over again. Now that's not fair. So I don't mean to give a slight to consultants, because I am one as I work with companies. But the reason why I tell that is when I work with companies, I tell them, and I genuinely mean that, is that my goal in working with a company is that they don't need me anymore. And I have some success stories where I worked enough with the companies that what I do and how I do it and my approach is so embedded in the organization that they said, we can do it ourselves. Why do we want to hire you? Which is what I want. The goal in many ways when I come into work with an organization as a consultant is almost always I start with education. So what are the principles of what we're doing, whether it be game theory or value chain and competency mapping or segmentation or any of the things I do with the company? The very first thing I will do is teach them the intuition and then the principles and then the process of what I will do with them so that they will eventually be able to do it themselves. The old proverb, if you teach someone to fish, the same principle applies here. And I think that that's the first reason. So ultimately, they don't need me anymore. The only reason someone would bring me in once they have that knowledge is bandwidth. They don't have the ability, the time really to do it themselves. The second is organizational buy-in. I believe really strongly that there's nothing more demotivating for an organization to have really good, smart people who almost always have their own views of what the organization should, can, and will eventually be, and have we have some smarter people coming in from the outside to tell us what we should be doing. Now it's up to you to go execute it. I believe it's much more empowering, much more courageous, to pick up on you, Pierre, to be able to have the people developing the strategy, developing what we're doing with our tactics themselves, and then in turn having them be the ones to execute it. Because you're now part of the decision-making process and you're now having to execute what you came up with, you being a collective team. In the middle of a couple of projects right now, we're doing just that. So long-winded way of saying, always I bring in the learnings that we know from other organizations and learnings from academia. And I believe there are two benefits in many ways. One, we get the best academic thinking. So I do a lot with game theory, and we have a rich mathematical and empirical, i.e. statistic, literature in game theory that teaches us about what companies can do. It's nice to bring that into an organization. And then the second part of that is that we can learn from others. So there's a great Harvard Business Review article, Pierre, from years ago called The Innovator's DNA. And it looks at what most innovative people in business over the years, what are their characteristics? And the number one trait that article found was what I call stealing. And I don't mean it in a bad way. They called it associating. And I mean stealing in a good way. That is, we see a business model, we see an approach in another industry that's been successful in another company, and we think about how we can use it to disrupt our own business model. And that's can we take an Uber model and apply it to ours? Can we use a software as a service model and bring it to our industry? What can we learn from others? So those two things, as we bring in from the outside, to me is really what when I work with companies on a consulting basis, I do. Anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your initial question. I think almost always, maybe one or two exceptions over my career where I don't do teaching first.
Yeah, Bill, it's one thing to be lecturing to a group of students, B-school students, or even executives in an executive leadership program. It's another thing to be consulting with a company and integrating that teaching component to your consultancy. It's a totally different thing, maybe in some regard, to turn these principles and theories and associations to your own practice and your own business as an entrepreneur. And I know we had some really sobering conversations several months ago about some things that you were doing and how you had to shift as a result. And really putting, the title of our conversation is Testing B School Theories, putting some of these theories and experiences into practice. Can you highlight some of those stories? I mean, so many great lessons from the experiences of you pivoting that I love for our audience to be able to take in.
Yeah, it's interesting. What we do, and I always view, I think of a river, and a river or water goes to the path of least resistance. And, there's the old cliched saying, was the low hanging fruit. And, what I've done over my career is, in many ways, I built what is the low hanging fruit. That is, I have knowledge as an economist, as a business school professor, as someone who studies business, to help companies do things. And started out more with executive education, less with consulting. And over the years, as I got more and more experience, I was able to gain insights from the companies. And I'd say, on balance, I may have learned more from the companies than they learned from me. That as I go in and I observe, I see what works, what they do, and then I adapt that for other examples. So one of the things I learned early on is the importance of diversification. So probably my biggest client over the year, not probably, but by far my biggest client over the years is the Boeing company. I've been working with them now for 20 years. And so, I mean, in the consulting business, we're having a client for 20 years is very unusual. You usually, for one reason or another, people come and go, you move on. So I was totally diversified. I did executive education. I did straight line consulting with the educational piece. I taught at universities. I did executive education. And I thought, I mean, if one part goes down, we have a recession, I have the university stuff. If for whatever reason, executive education pivots, I have the consulting side. I thought I had small companies, large companies, Fortune 100 startups. I was diversified as it can be. The only thing I didn't diversify against is in person and pandemic. So the only thing I didn't think of and count on, what if I can't do what I do in person? The thing common to all of those things was I did them in person live. I consulted in person. I gave executive sessions on a subject. I gave keynote talks at a conference in person. And so enter the pandemic a little over a year ago. And many of us who are business school professors across the country came into the same situation. I wrote an article that I put out there a while back. I called the new buzzword is reinvention. Everyone across the country, not just me, but everyone at a major business school, top faculty at top business schools, have had to reinvent themselves. What we used to do no longer applies. So and this is a trend that started a long time ago, but now it's been accelerated, like much of what we do at home these days, is that we now have had to change. If we're teaching, it's now blended. We do a lot of offline, what they call asynchronous material online that people can look at their leisure. And then all of a sudden we got to do the live that can interact. So I'm working with a client now. It's a Fortune 100, Fortune 10 company, pretty big company, who we're doing some work on 3 areas of their business. And the first thing I did for them is by the way, one of the things, I'll come back to your original question. One of the things I did at the beginning of the pandemic is I spent the time setting up a home video studio. Pretty detailed with 2 Nikon cameras from multiple angles and lights and all the stuff you do that I know you know. And I spent much of the pandemic putting my life's work on video. The subject of the 2 books, every course I teach, I have 250 hours of videos that I put together, had professionally edited, and put together on an LMS under the EDX banner. So a reasonably good interface so people can come and view my life's work. And so it's kind of funny. I'll tell people, which is true, I'll be upstairs in this house where I am right now. I have a 2nd floor bedroom that wasn't being used. And in the middle of the pandemic, I'll have a tie, get a little bit of a secret here, a tie, a suit, kind of like you see in the picture of me. And I have kind of casual pants, no shoes, no socks. At 1 a.m. with the lights on a Saturday night, sitting in that room alone, recording. Literally, that's what I was doing. Maybe not the best thing to do in a pandemic. But the reason why I tell that is that was a change that I recognized early on in the pandemic, that the accelerating trend to offline education is only going to get bigger through time. And so that was one of many activities I engaged in during this pandemic to transform what I'm doing. Pretty much when the pandemic hit, say March of 2020, it was pretty clear that what the old way of doing everything we do, whether it be business as usual, whether it be education, consulting, it's all going to change. And so the question is, how can you pivot more quickly? And I started a number of different businesses and a number of different initiatives during the period because I recognized that we would need to reinvent ourselves.
You said a number of different ones. Can you give us a quick breakdown? I was, when we had this conversation before, I was blown away trying to write and keep up. Can you give us a quick breakdown of all the businesses that you started in the middle of the pandemic? Yeah,
started a number of businesses, and actually talking about another one starting now with a couple of colleagues. The good thing is when you're working with other really good people, you can leverage your strengths. So it's not like you're like with me, I'm in the middle of one startup, I'm in the middle of 5 or 6. And the reason why is it's not all just me. So probably the two main ones, and there are others, but I'll start with the two. The first one is an organization called Brij, and Brij, and the URL is bridgecommunity.com. And we recognized, a couple colleagues of mine back in March of last year, that small business is going to be decimated. And our hearts went out to all the small businesses that were struggling. And so we created it's now patent pending, pretty sophisticated backend and database architecture to help small businesses get through the pandemic and then thrive after. Obviously, we're kind of in between the two, although businesses have a lot of people coming back live now that things in the States are opening up. They're still struggling, a mountain of debt, can't find workers, and they're still having a struggle. So we started the business to help them in a different way. Most of the sites that you could help a small business back a year ago were what we call one and done. Go to GoFundMe, give them money, and then GoFundMe moves on to the next shiny object. Mm-hmm. We try to say, let's stay with that business and help them use those customers that were so loyal that were willing to give money to keep them in business. That's marketing gold. That's the community you want to stay in touch with. That's the community you want to give preferential treatment for later. Let's stay with them and help them do what we call promotions, bridge promotions, after the pandemic has passed. So a real quick story, I think I told you in the last conversation, Pierre, but the part of the motivation for what we're trying to do, and there are many different iterations, combinations, and versions of this kind of promotion. But true story, I'm at a bar in Durham, North Carolina. I'm saving a seat for someone. It's a place called Bar Virgil, if anyone ever goes to Durham, North Carolina. And a guy comes up and starts to sit down. It's the only seat left at the bar that I'm saving. And I said, no, I'm sorry. I'm saving that for someone. And he says, no, that's my chair. And now the New Yorker in me comes out. And I literally said to him, excuse me, pal, what are we in the 3rd grade? What part of I'm saving that seat for someone don't you understand? And he looks at me and he walks away. And I mean, that's exactly what I said and exactly what he did. And he comes on the other side of the bar, he's still looking at me kind of oddly, walks over again. I'm like, okay, am I going to get into a fight? What's going on here? And he says, that is my seat. And I'll be damned, that was his seat. It has his name on it. He was such a loyal customer that they put his name on the seat. And it ended up being friendly. I bought him a beer. We hung out. When my friend came, they ended up doing the same. It was a great example. But we thought, well, why can't you're struggling? That's an ancillary revenue source. A brewery in Lyman, Maine, Funky Bow, took this idea and created a bridge promotion where they named a beer after someone. So imagine going to a beer with a bunch of to a brewery or a restaurant with a bunch of your friends and having your name on the menu or up on a chalkboard. It's the Pierre Quinn Martini. I don't know, right? Or maybe you want to go to a restaurant, you can't get a reservation. Oh, you're a Brij member. We'll bring you in. We'll find a table for you. You were so loyal to us when we were struggling. We want to help you now. It's that something for something model. So that was one. And we're now rolling out through multiple. We have a separate side business that we're doing called Main Street Crawl that we ran in Durham, North Carolina back in May. And what that is businesses run specials and you buy a ticket. And during the day, you go from business to business and they give you something special. Someone called it, best description I heard, someone said, this is kind of like trick-or-treating for adults. You go to each restaurant, you don't know what you're going to get. And you do it during the day. Anyway, so those are two, Brij and Main Street Crawl. This LMS that I talk about with all those educational courses that I have, we have 11 courses up there. It's under Chestnut Hill Associates on the education side is yet another. So those are a few. On the consulting side, I started a business with a couple of colleagues of mine that we've done years ago, that we started years ago, but we're now formalizing, called Paradox. It's paradoxteam.com, and it's all about managing paradoxes in business. So we have a 3-day session where we come in and we teach businesses how to manage what we call paradoxes. We have to manage the inbox and get everything done every day, but we also plan for the long term. We have to train our people so they're productive in the long run, but that takes away time. They're not being productive now. So we have to manage productivity now and manage the long-term success of the organization. So it's all these paradoxes that we balance. And the metaphor we use is submarines, because submarines are the only ship built to sink.
Yeah.
So a paradox in water. So we go to submarine bases and subvets, as they call them, locations, someone in Groton, Connecticut. So you go with someone who's a commander, for example, of a nuclear submarine, or an admiral in the Navy in years past, and learn from what they learned on a submarine. So, for example, there are no errors. We can't make mistakes. If you make a mistake, we all die.
Yeah.
So teamwork and leadership becomes crucially important. Talk about courageous people on the submarines are just amazing what we can learn from them. So that's another business we built where we go in and work with organizations, usually for 3 days, could be 2, where we try and teach their people how to manage that balance. Another one I started is with a colleague of mine, Phil Burns, called Platform for Strategic Growth. Platformforstrategicgrowth.com. Go figure, right? And what we do is he manages the customer journey really well. So he goes and does deep dives into a customer, and literally goes and lives and breathes what's it like to be a customer and to see what the organization we're working for looks like from the eyes of the customer. And he maps out that customer experience journey interacting with our customer. On the flip side, I often do in my strategy work, the industry analysis. I have things I call strategic control points, things that if you can get a hold of and have unique ability to do, you can leverage it for extraordinary margins throughout the value chain. And I try and find them for the company. And then when you put together the two is where we say the magic happens in strategy. You put together the unique thing you can do that the customer really wants. And the good companies, the Elon Musks of the world, the Jeff Bezos of the world, find ways to make that happen. And I'd say the last major initiative I've done, and it's a continuation of something I've done before, and the reason why I'm wearing pink here today is an organization called Real Men Wear Pink. I work with them every year. We have leaders here in the Triangle in North Carolina, 25 of them, from people on the Supreme Court to anchors on local news stations to the voice of the Carolina Hurricanes, people who have been successful in the business, CTOs, a couple of CEOs of organizations, myself. There are 25, soon to be 35 of us that spend much of the year trying to raise money for breast cancer research. So we're trying to, like with the motivation of Brij to do good, help, give back to small businesses, we're trying to give back to local community. And as a result of this, we started something called Consultants versus Cancer. So it's consultantsversuscancer.org. And what we do is, like the consulting work I do the same exact thing, except the only difference is instead of giving me the money, you donate the money to the American Cancer Society.
Wow.
So I just give my time.
Yeah.
And so the way I always look at it is in years past, and I know I haven't told you this story, but the motivation for that is back a number of years ago, going back a few years, but 20 years now, I'd done some work for the Special Olympics organization out of DC, the headquarters, and we had done an economic impact study on when they were holding the World Games back 20-something years ago in New Haven, Connecticut. And before that economic impact study, the World Games or the Special Olympics, which, by the way, is the largest sporting event in the world when it's held every year. It's on off Olympic years, and so it's not competing with Olympic for scale. We're begging cities to take it. And we showed in the one that had happened in New Haven, Connecticut, that it generated about $200 million in economic activity in the city when it's brought to the city.
Wow.
And so as a result, they put it out for bid. And the next World Games, which were held in Dublin, brought in $40 million. So the city paid them $40 million to give it to the city of Dublin so that it would generate $200 to $300 million of economic activity for the city. It was a win-win. We could argue they could have leveraged it for more. And I often say I could never in a million years, donate $40 million, write a check to a Special Olympics organization for $40 million. I can do something in the way of my consulting activities to generate that income. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with Consultants versus Cancer. If we can help the businesses generate and they give back to ACS, we all win. So those are just some very long-winded version again of the things I've been trying to do to reinvent what I do as a business school professor. It used to be you go in, you teach. You then use that in person to moderate and facilitate strategy development. It's no longer that.
There's a theme that I'm hearing. There's multiple themes that are rising to the surface, but there's one theme that I'm really keying in on, and there's this idea of the entrepreneur, of the business leader, kind of walled up in his or her garage or in her office typing at a keyboard or doing their thing by themselves. And what I'm hearing from you is this theme of community. You're always talking about, I'm partnering with someone, I'm working with I'm bringing a group of people together. Can you demystify, maybe if you're teaching you pop into the undergraduate level and you're giving sort of a 200, 300 level overview of what it means to be in business, can you demystify this idea of the isolated, insular entrepreneur or executive trying to run a company?
Great question and great insight, Pierre. It's funny, I haven't really thought about it that way, but you're 100% right. I do think back in the day, back in the start of Apple Day with Steve Jobs and colleagues, that much of it was sitting there and coding. And there's the Ashton Kutcher, what's that show? What took over for Charlie Sheen? But he's in with coding, and that's all they do. And you have to code, of course. That's a real important part of what we do. And the coding aspect of any technology is often done with one or two people sitting up till 4 or 6 to 8 in the morning coding, but that's just a small portion. Your comment and your insight, Pierre, reminded me of a question I asked of someone who was a serial entrepreneur who was very successful over the years, and someone I respect a great deal, someone named Jay Parkinson. Jay Parkinson started many companies, a medical doctor, but also a serial entrepreneur. He's done many exits where he's turned the company into profit for himself. But he started a company called Sherpa, SHERPAA.com. It was kind of telehealth, telemedicine before telemedicine became more popular during the pandemic. And I asked him if there's something, I asked him two things. One, what would you do differently in hindsight in starting those companies? And he says, I never appreciated the importance of operations. I have someone I'm a medical doctor. I have someone who's a finance person, but getting it done on the ground, I always just figured we'd do it. But getting stuff done on the ground becomes so important. So I realized I can't do it by myself as a medical doctor, even if I have that code, the person who can code and develop, the developer who can generate the platform. The two of us can't do it themselves because no one's getting out and to see the customer. And so he realized that it's a collaborative effort. The three of them needs to come together. And then the other thing he said, which always stuck with me, is always learn from others, is I said, if you could give advice to an MBA, a freshly minted MBA, executive or otherwise, coming out that's about to start a career or start a business, what advice would you give to them? And he said, buy a whiteboard. Not what I expected. And he said, literally sketch out the business. What is it? What's the flow of money in the industry and always follow the money, but sketch it out. So I think about it, as you sketch it out, there's no one person that has expertise through the entire part of that value chain. There's going to be, everyone is their own individual expertise. So this Brij, as I mentioned before, we have someone who's a PhD in computer science. I do strategy in business. We have someone who used to be the head of marketing at the World Trade Center and at Hudson Yards. We have someone else who leads a country, who leads Canada for another company, based here in the U.S. So we have someone who is a lawyer. So we have all the different skill sets together. And the tough part I'm learning through all these startups, the tough part is keeping people in their swim lanes. When you're in marketing or strategy, everyone knows marketing or strategy. We always think we should do this or that. And so the problem, you always want to listen to that advice, but it gets very messy when people start overlapping what they do. And so having a tight organizational structure where everyone contributes with their base knowledge maybe gives advice, but that you keep the structure organizationally, the management structure of the team is maybe one of the bigger challenges you have when you have 3, 4, 5 people that are starting a company together. But your original premise is 100% correct. It used to be, okay, I created the next shiny object, the next greatest widget alone in my basement or in my garage somewhere, and then I go tell the world about it and everyone beats down the door, is, I think, largely a thing of the past.
You know, Bill, you have books out, you have a teaching, a list of classes you have to teach, you have consulting clients. You know, I asked you last time we were doing a podcast, you know, when do you have time to sleep? There's a lot going on. But then there's also space and collaboration and network and interest in learning from each other. This is the section of our conversation. I know I took you a little longer than I originally planned, but you know, once you have a world-class B school professor talking, you just got to let them talk and let's soak in everything. So I wanted to do that today. But I also want to ask you, as it relates to connecting with you, learning more about your work, or even working with you, what are some of the best ways for people to link up, to connect with you? I call this shameless plug time. So
no, that's nice.
Yeah, lay it all on us.
So that's nice. So it's really simple. You have Putsis.com there. That's probably the second place I would go. But if you want to know about me, read perhaps some of the things I've written that's currently out in the news now, some videos and the like, that's a great place to go. The second would be to ChestnutHillAssociates.com. One word, ChestnutHillAssociates.com is literally everything's out there. All the businesses I've talked about, there are links to all those businesses. There are links to the book, a little bit about me, some videos so you can see what I do live in front of an audience. But I'd say those two places. And the email addresses, I always love to hear from people, and people always, I don't know why, hesitate to reach out. I think at least I like to think I'm pretty approachable. I go by Bill, not Doctor, any of that stuff. And I always love when I get people to write to me just to think about things. But probably the easiest email, just because it's easy to remember, is William. Just put a dot in between my first and last name, so William.Putsis at yale.edu, YALE as in university. But that's probably the easiest email.
Listen, some of you may be a little apprehensive, maybe a little hesitant. And I know we do these interviews all the time on LinkedIn Live, and everyone says, hey, reach out to me. They actually mean it. And if you go to YouTube, just go to YouTube and type in William Putsis and hit enter. Click on videos, you'll understand that Bill is the real deal, and it's an amazing opportunity to be able to connect with him. So Bill, I want to thank you for being my guest on Courageous Conversations today, and I want to thank you in advance for all the great work that you're going to do as people activate the courage to reach out to you and get connected and learn from you and partner with you. Thanks for hanging out today.
My pleasure, Pierre. It's always great to be with you, and great to connect. Thank you.
Again soon, okay?
Yeah, thanks. You too.